My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a monthly town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. To call it a time of upheaval in city and state affairs would be an understatement. Andrew Cuomo, who rode herd over Albany and City Hall like a colossus unchained, resigned in the face of certain impeachment over multiple credible claims of sexual harassment in an office marked by intimidation. Bill de Blasio, freed from the petty and not so petty harassments that Cuomo rained on him daily, appeared buoyantly to be cruising to the end of his term until, as always happens in New York City, reality bit, most egregiously in a jails crisis centered on Rikers Island that saw a dozen inmates die even as the city struggles to manage a jail system with increasing staff shortages. Eric Adams, the Democratic mayoral nominee, all but certain to take over City Hall next January unless the apocalypse comes early, has carefully begun staking out less ideological positions on the vexing issues that face the city and has established a strong working relationship with our new governor, Kathy Hochul, who is not only our first female governor, but the first from Western New York in a century. Hochul, who promises a far more collegial working relationship with legislators in City Hall, has sent a clear message in her short time in office. She is no lame duck, not only cleaning out many Cuomo holdovers, but staffing up for next year's statewide elections by naming a team to run her re-election campaign. And even as we try to rebuild from the ongoing ravages of the COVID pandemic, lawmakers in Albany will be distracted by that ultimate 10-year battle over redistricting when, despite the protestations of good government types, lawmakers insist on picking their voters instead of the other way around. The same distractions will infect City Hall, where council members, including an expanded number of women, Latinos, and leftists poised to push the body to the left, are in their own 2-year terms until council districts are redrawn and they run for their own re-election in 2023. As always, the problems afflicting the city and state are a reflection of our chaotic national politics, where one party seems to be dabbling with Hungarian-style authoritarianism, while the other wrestles with its own ideological flanks, will not wait until politics works itself out. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers with vast experience in wrestling with civic and political affairs in Albany and New York City. Liz Benjamin, a former colleague of mine at the Daily News, is managing director in Albany for Marathon Strategies and was the longtime host of Capital Tonight. Basil Smikle is the director of public policy programs at the Roosevelt Public Policy Institute at Hunter College. Bruce Jory, whose experience in Albany goes back to before the previous Governor Cuomo, I think I'm older than him, so I'm not picking on him, is the senior advisor for government and regulatory affairs from Nat Phelps and Phillips, and one of the preeminent analysts of statewide civic affairs. And Gloria Pazmino is a politics reporter with New York One, who, among other things, has been covering the Rikers Island crisis with clarity and compassion, and will tell us what it all means. Bruce, you and I have been around a long time, and the level of chaos we're seeing in Albany, combined with a 6, 7, 8 month transition, with all due respect to Mr. Sleeper, the Republican nominee for mayor, is not a recipe for government getting things done.
I think you're right. We have a settling in and settling out, forgive the oxymoron, in Albany, of a new administration coming in, but having to deal with some major issues. I mean, the whole how you deal with COVID, how you deal with the immunizations, school reopenings, getting out the undocumented worker fund, getting that money up and out, getting the rental assistance fund up and out. And then you are quite correct. The long transition to New York City, where everybody presumes, I think correctly, that Eric Adams will be the next mayor, and de Blasio has a rather long lame duck period, but Adams is not in a position to make decisions yet. So it's kind of like it's chaotic, but quiet. It's not angry, but it's ominous. So it's an interesting time to be tracking government and politics.
We've also been around a long time, you and I, and the relationship between the governor and the mayor was toxic, to say the least. I think it was more one way. What's the impact in Albany? Is there a sense of relief? Is there Is there a sense that Hochul is a breath of fresh air, and whether it's de Blasio or it's Adams, that relationships will be more normal? What's changed?
Is that to me or to Liz?
Liz, what's changed?
I mean, everything and nothing at the same time. I mean, look, Albany is still Albany. It has a whole different stratosphere, like its own people. I think during David Patterson's time, he called it Planet Albany. Someone else might have coined that, but we'll just give it to the former governor. And the reality is that it just has its own time frame and tides, and it's very hard to change that, right? I mean, governors come and go, and yet the previous governor was really a force with which to be reckoned, and he lived by the sword and died by the sword, right? His former chief of staff, which in Albany is known as the secretary to the governor, once infamously said, "We have two speeds, get along and kill." That's no way to run a railroad, and I think that he, like a former governor before him who also fell from grace, Eliot Spitzer, found that when you rule with an iron fist like that, you don't have a lot of friends when you need them when time comes for you to depart. So he hung on longer than I think a lot of people thought. Many people thought we would be headed towards an impeachment trial, which would have been historic, only has happened once and none of us were alive at that point. But so, you know, that was certainly significant. And I think New Yorkers are weary of all the scandal that we've seen. Albany's been a mess of scandal for a really long time. Kathy Hochul, I think the jury's still out on her. She has a lot of convincing to do. She's trying to sort of fly the airplane while building it, which is difficult. She has to hire and staff up. She's trying to do that. She said she was going to get rid of a lot of the dead weight or former Cuomo holdovers. She's done some of that. But you also need bodies to run the government. So you can't get rid of everybody all at once. And there are many problems and challenges that she faces, not the least of which is the pandemic. Her one positive that she has is that the state is awash in cash. And so that's actually dangerous. And Bruce will tell you when there's too much cash, it's actually a problem. It's easier for them to cut than it is to go on a crazy spending spree and try to figure out who's going to get the money, particularly in an election year. And she's trying to be, yes, bipartisan and conciliatory and set a different tone than her predecessor. But at the same time, she's being very partisan by saying, well, you know, I'm all for a legislative redistricting plan and a congressional redistricting plan that benefits Democrats because I'm a Democrat. I mean, she's running and she's also being the governor at the same time. And I think Mario Cuomo said, you campaign in poetry, you govern in prose. Did I get that right? So, you know, she's trying to read poetry and prose at the same time. You can't speak at both sides of your mouth. It's very difficult. And she's thus far not had any significant missteps, but a lot of people are circling and watching for it. And of course, Jumaane Williams has already said he's probably going to challenge her, and we're all waiting to see what Tish James does. I mean, there's a lot of upheaval. In terms of a breath of relief, I'm not sure that Albany has any more relief to give, to be honest. It's just a tired bunch of people who have really been through the ringer in the New York political class.
Why does this matter? I mean, does this matter when it comes to policy? I mean, we're still a city with tremendous need, you know, whether it's jobs, whether it's the, recovery from COVID, whether it's the, schools, whether it's Rikers, whether it's police issues. Is this all a distraction and government's going on? Does this really mean anything?
No, of course it means something because the person in the seat of tremendous power always matters. The person, and I always say governors always win. Cities are creatures of the state, and whose governor actually does matter. That relationship between city and state really does matter. When you think about something like education, where you have some funding from the federal government, but a lot of decisions that are made at the state level in terms of how New York City schools are governed, for example. Who's in charge really, and the relationship that that person has with the city matters a whole heck of a lot when you think about something like mayoral control, for example, or the lifting of the charter cap, which has historically been a contentious issue. So that kind of conversation that has taken place under a previous governor and the current for a short time mayor, which has not always gone very well. The hope for voters is that it will go well. It will go much more smoothly than it has in the past. That's a hope. I don't know that that's the reality, but certainly there is this sense that that given all the things that Bruce laid out at the beginning, all the policies, all the dollars, all the concerns around COVID and vaccinations and such that are, that voters are really thinking about and worrying over right now, they want an adult in the room. We talked about that a lot back in the day. 10 years ago or more, Andrew Cuomo was the adult in the room, right? He campaigned as such after a coup, after Patterson, right? And so Andrew Cuomo was supposed to use a science fiction sort of reference, he was supposed to bring balance to the force, right? But clearly, over some period of time, things started to unravel. And I think New Yorkers do want some stability in their policymaking and in their leadership.
Basil makes the point that the relationship between the governor and the mayor in particular has an impact on policy. With Cuomo and de Blasio, it was frankly grotesque. And de Blasio was buoyant after the fall of Cuomo. I mean, he was cruising, and reality did bite. And you have this very strange dance between him and Adams is being very careful. Adams is he's really, I happen to think he's a very deep thinker about, issues. He talks about upstream issues. And that's why you have upstream social problems, which is related to crime. You have upstream lack of affordable health care, which leads to diabetes on a street level. You have this very strange interregnum where we don't know who's in charge and who we should be dealing with.
Yeah, but I think what we've seen, at least in the last couple of months, is the real importance of having a governor and a mayor that are at least willing to talk to each other, which between de Blasio and the former governor, Governor Cuomo, we saw the breakdown of communication and a working relationship really affect so many different things here in the city, everything from the MTA, the subway systems, to public schools, some handling of the pandemic, and really everyday things that affect people that live here in the city. Partnership is important, but more than partnership, it's really at least the willingness to work together. And I think we've already seen some evidence of that. Kathy Hochul announced just a couple of days ago the fund for people that were impacted by Hurricane Ida and who may be undocumented and would not, as a result, would not qualify for federal assistance. The majority of those people are here in New York City. So her and the mayor partnered on that in order to get some relief to people. So I think that's the most recent example I can think of what it means to have two executives that are working together. But we'll see. I think there's a vaccination effort and that is underway, and the challenges that government is facing in terms of mandates, what to do about public employees that refuse a mandate, the court battle that is happening. You have to have a government that is in sync both at the state and the local level, because if you have a governor that's saying, I'm not going to impose a mandate, and then you have a mayor that's trying to run the country's biggest school system saying, I will impose a mandate, that's going to just create confusion and chaos at a time that we need some sort of stability and ability to work together in order to really help the recovery along.
When we have basically gridlock once again in Washington, D.C. Bruce, I don't want to let this go by, the significance of her being from Western New York. Nobody is more parochial than somebody from New York City. We are the center of the world, and if you don't think so, we don't really give a damn. But this is the first one in 100 years. All of her moves appear to be aimed at shoring up or creating a base. I shouldn't say shoring up, creating a base in New York City. But is there a significance for that? Because you've looked at how people get
Yeah,
with Tish James hanging around
Yeah, Hochul confounds political handicappers because the math changes. Most strong candidates for governor, particularly incumbents or the leading candidates, come to it with they're strong in their party's primary and they have potential in the general election. That's the usual template or path. Hochul is exactly the opposite. She is absolutely the Republicans' worst nightmare in a general election to run against. Absolutely. On the math, if you want me to give you the math, I'll explain it. But in a primary, she has potential, but she doesn't have overwhelming strength. Now, here's what that's based on. In a Democratic primary, 52 to 55% of the vote comes from New York City. The higher the overall turnout, the higher the New York City share is. The downstate suburbs are 19 to 20. That's Long Island, Westchester, and Rockland. Upstate's 25 to 30%. The lower the overall turnout, the higher upstate share is. So that means if Hochul can crack into the New York City base amongst four of the six key votes, either African American, Hispanics, outer borough Jews, white Catholics, Asians, and LGBTQ, if she can crack into even three of those, but particularly if she carries four of the six, she's completely erased the New York City regional advantage in that primary to her benefit, because outside of New York City, with the exception of the area from Peekskill up to Plattsburgh, which is Vermont West, in terms of progressive strength, the party is overwhelmingly a mix of white Catholics in the lead, with minority voters and Jewish voters there. So there's all kinds of crazy combinations. Now, in a general election, that totally turns. In a general election, 42 to 45% of the vote comes from upstate New York, 24% comes from the suburbs, and New York City is either 30% to 34%. So if you're a pro-choice, pro-environment, Irish Catholic woman from Western New York, the first woman governor and the first elected upstate governor since Franklin Roosevelt in 1928. Not Nathan Miller, but I'll have that quibble with Liz's father, who's an outstanding professor at New Paltz. That gives Hochul tremendous advantages in the general election. So, but I want to say this. Gloria Pezmino's reporting on Rikers has been stellar. If they gave Pulitzer Prizes for broadcast news reporting, she'd get a Pulitzer. She deserves it. And one of the things is what Mr. Lincoln said. I confess plainly, events have controlled me. I have not controlled events. Most politicians are not wise enough or humble enough to admit that. How events interplay and affect all these various candidates for governor and the new mayor are going to overwhelm all the petty political machinations of people who do what Basil and I do for a living when we're not academics.
Jump in. I mean, do you see this dynamic? I mean, you've obviously worked in the city for a long time as well as up in Albany. How is this playing out in your mind? Is it significant that we have a governor from Western New York?
To me, Bob, listen, another hat that I wore, I was the executive director of the state Democratic Party. So I had the great fortune of visiting all 62 counties in this state for the second time in my career. And I will tell you that, in addition to a lot of the numbers and stats that Bruce threw out, and he's absolutely on point with that, there is an extraordinary amount of pride coming from upstate. Those voters know, you have a lot of Democrats in a sea of red. So they take their responsibility as voters, as Democratic voters, as participants in this party process. They take that very, very seriously. So they do turn out. And having crisscrossed the state with Kathy Hochul while I was ED and she lieutenant governor, she essentially served as the sort of both cheerleader for the administration and for the party. We got to know each other pretty well, and she is beloved, and particularly among the white women upstate who have been really working very hard to cobble together a tremendous amount of support among younger Democrats, particularly women, to run for office, which recruiting to run in some of these areas is extraordinarily difficult. And she's been helpful to that. So if you layer on top of that something like Eleanor's legacy, whose sole responsibility is to elect more women to public office in the state of New York. You have a lot of these, and by the way, someone who was on the board of that, Karen Persicelli-Keough, is now, right, Secretary of the Governor. And so there are a lot of opportunities, I would say, for Kathy to be able to bring together a lot of the support across the state. As Liz alluded to earlier, you know, the Jumaane entrance, a Tish entrance does make it really interesting. And it could potentially, you know, in some ways, Kathy's looking at this and saying, I need Tish and Jumaane to be in this space.
Yep.
But, you know, there's some version that where she's sitting back thinking that. But going head to head against Jumaane, who did very well against her in running for lieutenant governor, going head to head against Tish, that's tough. But it makes for an extraordinary campaign season.
Bob, if I may, just a couple of added thoughts. First of all, I think that Buffalonians would definitely take issue with your assertion that New York City is the center of the world. If you know Buffalo, you know that Buffalonians feel very, very strongly about being from Buffalo.
Their football teams are certainly better right now.
Well, right. Hopefully they stick around. If the Bubulas are watching this, Kathy Hochul's got a number of challenges, and keeping the Buffalo Bills in Buffalo is one of them. But, there's a couple of things that are at play here. Bruce made a pretty astute point, not unusual for him, when he said that he thought that, Kathy Hochul would be the Republicans' worst nightmare. First of all, I don't think Lee Zeldin is probably the strongest Republican candidate that they could have put forward, nor is Andrew Giuliani, who really needs no explanation. But in terms of what's going on right now, I mean, yes, it's true that Jumaane Williams did better than a lot of people expected against Kathy Hochul. But you got to look at what's happening in Buffalo right now, which probably New York City will have no idea, with the exception of present company excluded. You got a guy, Byron Brown, who is handpicked, former state chairman, succeeded you, maybe, Basil, I think. Governor Cuomo put him in there as the Democratic Party.
We overlapped for a little bit.
So he's a pragmatic, kind of a centrist guy. Buffalo has a lot more in common with, say, Cleveland than it does with New York City. It's more of a Midwestern sensibility, and it's definitely skews to the right. And there's this saying, as goes Cheektowaga, so goes New York, right? So I just, and I've always been a protector and a champion of upstate, certainly. But in this instance, the fact that India Walton, who is a self-professed Democratic socialist, upended in a surprise primary victory Byron Brown, and now Byron Brown is running a write-in candidacy, and he is cleaning her clock in the polls. Now, what happens in November, I do not know, because it's hard to be a write-in, and he lost his ballot status challenges. And his lawyer, by the way, is Dennis Vacco, which is a very strange situation that only happens in Buffalo. Former state attorney general is Republican, defending a guy like Byron Brown, and Dennis is a great guy. It's just their politics do not match at all. But if that situation, plays out the way I think it will, which is to say that I think Byron Brown will probably be successful, then progressives in New York really have to take a hard look at that, because it's really not smart for the Democratic Party. And I'm sort of preaching to the choir, because I know all present company knows this. And in fact, Eric Adams said it, and Eric Adams won on a pragmatic centrist campaign that he ran, not defund the police, but in fact support the police and reform the police to some degree. But public safety is paramount, which is not the mantra that we were hearing from Democrats, 6 to 8 months ago. If this all plays out the way that I think it will, if you get a Jumaane Williams or a Tish James and she or he topples Kathy Hochul, and then subsequently, you've got the Working Families Party perhaps keeps one of those liberals in the mix for the general, you're in trouble. You may very well end up with Governor Giuliani or Governor Zeldin. And so I think that there's definitely lessons to be learned here from a political side of things, that, the Democrats have a long history of standing in a circle and shooting at one another, as we know. But this is a real seminal moment. And I think that, and I'm biased and I don't live there, just to be clear, I live outside Albany, but all roads run through Buffalo right now.
Oh, yeah. the references that Liz is making to the Democratic Socialist candidate, Indeed Walton,
Mhm.
had vast experience now over the last several years of Democratic Socialists picking off city council seats, state legislative seats, particularly in the state legislature. But Adams ran an explicit campaign against them,
Mhm.
arguing that they talk about the interest of poor people of color, and he talks to them. The crime issue being the primary example, and that's why you see in the Bronx, where the Democratic Socialist candidates did not do well in the Richie Torres congressional district in the Bronx, Adams basically sweeping working and middle class communities of color. There's a disconnect within the Democratic Party while the Republican Party fights with its, pardon my being partisan, lunatic fringe, which is now more than a fringe. Democratic Party is fighting with its two wings, and de Blasio at various times tried to be a pragmatist, but he could never escape his being an ideological mayor.
That's right. I'm so glad that Liz brought up the India Walton Byron Brown race, because I do think it's going to be sort of a predictor for what is to come in the next couple of races. I think what we saw in that race really, the curse of incumbency, a mayor who didn't feel it necessary to go out and campaign aggressively for reelection, essentially gets kicked off the ballot and beat in this primary by this Democratic socialist. But I think that, it's interesting, just this last weekend, India Walton was in New York City holding fundraisers. Jumaane Williams was hosting fundraisers for her, Cynthia Nixon, who formerly ran against Governor Andrew Cuomo. But I would bet my last dollar that there are plenty of Byron supporters right now who are campaigning on his behalf and saying, look, she wants to bring the politics of New York City. She wants to turn Buffalo into New York City. And that is going to play into a lot of people's fears. But I think what you bring up Eric Adams and what he's tried to do in his campaigning, Eric Adams is happy to note that he won every borough with the exception of Manhattan south of 96th Street. And one of my favorite things that we saw during the primary was the sort of mix that we saw in certain election districts. I think of Tiffany Caban, who formerly ran for district attorney in Queens, lost that race, ran for city council, and is poised to win in the general election. People in that district voted for her, Democratic Socialist, and they voted for Eric Adams. Definitely not a Democratic Socialist, someone who I think identifies more as a moderate Democrat. And I think that what that tells us is that voters want to be pragmatic, and they don't want, they recognize that you have to have a balance of both. Voters recognize that, yes, there is a place and a need to reform the police, and there's also a need for the police, instead of a lot of what we've seen in the last couple of years and the last months of campaigning, where people are really staking out extreme positions, defunding the police, abolishing the police department. Eric Adams has come in and say,
closing Rikers, just flat out closing it.
Or closing Rikers. And I think, the agreement now is that, certainly among some people, is that, yeah, there is a place in society for a jail, because there are some people that may need to be detained at any given point. But there's also now an acknowledgement that Rikers is not working as is, and that something really dramatic has to happen there.
I don't want to. Go ahead. Yes.
A point on what happened in Buffalo as opposed to what happened in New York. The dirty secret is that progressives, despite the Bernie Sanders rhetoric that if you elect progressives, they will dramatically increase the turnout, the reality is that progressives do best when the turnout is low. And they have about a third of the Democratic primary in most places, both in New York and nationally, and that if that is united and they can add on a significant share of the minority vote, which is what India Walton was able to do, in a low turnout primary, they can win. In a larger turnout primary, they don't do well. That's why Bernie Sanders never got the nomination. That's why Teach Out and Nixon each got smoked, holding about a third of the vote. So what's going to be interesting is over 900,000 people voted in the primary Eric Adams won. About 20,000 voted in the primary India Walton won. Now let's see whether India Walton can replicate that feat, and all credit to her for running a very organized, disciplined, relatively well-funded campaign, targeted her voters, did a great job. Can that hold in a general election?
Mhm.
And if she loses against a write-in candidacy by Brown, that'll make
Has
people.
anyone ever done that? Who in a significant race, Bruce?
Well,
'Cause
Lisa
and I ask you
Murkowski,
because
Lisa Murkowski won in Alaska.
in New York,
No,
you
it's pretty rare. The closest thing to it was when Al Vann and Roger Green were
Right.
tossed off the ballot, but it wasn't a write-in. They won on the old Liberal Party line after they lost the Democratic line. So it is a tough thing, but it's going to be interesting. Here's the thing Eric Adams did that was smart. He followed his mind and his soul and played smart politics. He realized there are two overlapping, two majorities on crime that exist side by side. One majority of New York City voters believes we need police reform and we need to deracialize and policing, and believes that to its core. There's another majority that believes that we don't want to defund the police. What we want is deracialized, proactive community policing. Now, if you put those two majorities in the Venn diagram form, since we're in an academic setting, I can say that, who feels strongest in that overlap of the Venn diagram? Older African Americans, Hispanics, and Asian voters. And that's the flag on which Adams planted his campaign, and he was rewarded accordingly. He did much better with an Asian candidate in the race amongst Asian voters than people thought, except those who voted at the end when he foolishly attacked Andrew Yang and Catherine Garcia. But he did very well in those that voted early and voted by mail. He carried the Hispanic vote and swept the African American and got just enough of outer borough white ethnics to have a big primary lead in the initial first place and hold on by the skin of his teeth in ranked choice voting. But, I think all candidates should look at that and say that those two majorities are what I need to play to. Reform police, deracialize it, no longer allow for racial profiling, but don't give up on proactive community policing given the overall rise in crime. And we just saw nationally murders up 30% across the nation. That grabs people's attention.
Yeah.
Well, I think if I just say very quickly, I think, to piggyback on that point, because one of the other races that was really fascinating to me is that we have a socialist now likely to represent Central Harlem in the city council, which for a lot of Black leaders is surprising and shocking for a lot of the older African-American leaders. Between that and the fact that there's a lot of bemoaning that the Harlem seat is not represented by an African-American. So to me, in many ways, there is this, at least, when you hear a lot of folks talk, this confluence of very big and important conversations about shifting ideology within the Democratic Party and a changing of the guard generationally.
Mm-hmm.
And those two things sort of happening at the same time are really creating a tremendous amount of friction on the ground. And electorally, what we're seeing is that the older folks have taken a lot for granted because it's in those areas where the machine used to be strong. Yes, they used to have very significant singular leadership in those areas that didn't really invest as much in the machine and the infrastructure. And under that, you've now got these individuals that represent the progressive aspects of the party that have created their own infrastructure to supplant what existed before. And that's where what's interesting about that is it remains to be seen where in other parts of the city that makes sense. I imagine that there are members of Congress in other parts of the city having had challenges or see some coming down the road that are trying to figure out, so how to invest in the machine without being the machine and attracting attention to the machine. But that's in a sort of important local conversation that I think a lot of folks wanted to have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and beyond, and they don't have it, and then they get pushed out of office.
Yes, I'm going to go to questions. Ernesto has some questions from students in the audience. Bruce, give me 2 minutes. I know this is absurd because we could do 2 hours on this. How distracting is redistricting to get things?
Very. I can do it in 30 seconds. Very. And it's the incumbents and the challengers are obsessed by it. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Let me just suggest this, if you'd allow me. One of the things is that we may be, when somebody who is a democratic socialist wins a legislative seat, we tend to think, there's an ideological change in the electorate. What may be going on is the sheer energy of these candidates in tapered districts with demographic change, where younger, particularly minority women, are doing very, very well. And the public is reacting to that energy and the need for change. What we don't yet know is whether they are fully endorsing or buying into the ideology. That, in my mind, remains to be seen. I'm not dismissing that the Democratic Party has moved further to the left ideologically, but I think any fair assessment is the progressives are, and particularly the socialists who are even behind the progressives in terms of numbers, are ascending but not ascendant. But many in the print media want to call it ascendant despite no empirical evidence that they are in fact ascendant, and particularly as to run as chief executives or for statewide office, as opposed to their increasing success in tapered districts where you have gentrification going on in minority neighborhoods, where a candidate that can cover those two things can do well.
And let me just say this really quick, because there's one thing we didn't actually talk about. The fact that, and I think that's right, we've seen them ascend to office, but there's a question about legislative record. What I've focused on as well are the pressure points, right? Who's pressuring whom and how far can they be pulled in either direction? And one of the things that I think in some ways the jury's still out on is what of this legislature post IDC. And I say that in part because I had a hand in toppling that to some extent.
Not everybody even knows what that is anymore.
I'm sorry, yes, right. The Independent Democratic Caucus.
Democrats who caucused with Republicans.
Democrats who caucused with
Jeff Klein
Republicans.
Democrats, yeah.
Correct. And all the rage during the Cuomo years, but a lot of folks around the state didn't like the fact that they existed and were pushing to have them primaried and kicked out. And at the state party, we pushed a resolution to force them to caucus or challenge them, and they were challenged, and I think most, if not all, were ousted eventually. So that said, I do think this question of, do we have a real ideological shift that is present in the legislation is something that we still have to see. Because I don't know that
would say that that's already been on display. You didn't think that the last tenant protection package, for example, was demonstrated that?
Yeah, but I also think that stuff was in the pipeline already. I only know because, I know it was in the pipeline.
I only
already.
know because I know.
Because I know. I'm sorry. I know we could do this all day. No, I know some of this was in the pipeline. So I do think that we've seen some effect of that. But I do think now, in particular, when you have more progressives moving into the legislature, I am interested to see if there are breaks, right? If there are any substantial forces pulling back, or are we going to continue down a path
But
That's
just,
what
but Bob, just on redistricting, the mere concept that we thought that we were going to be able to, we were going to have an independent redistricting commission and we were going to take partisan out of redistricting. What a bunch of hooey. Like the idea that this entity was going to be able to somehow come to an agreement that it wouldn't, that, I mean, it was, first of all, it was underfunded. It was, you know, they were delayed because the former governor did not give them the resources that they needed. He was never really fully on board with that whole effort, just to be clear. I'm not really sure New Yorkers even knew what it was that they were approving when they approved it. And then come to find out that like, oh, dueling plans, what a surprise. I mean, why is anybody shocked by that? There's nothing surprising about it whatsoever.
Liz, I want to go to a question, but where redistricting has national significance is can the Democrats carve out some Republican seats and add to this very thin Democratic majority in Washington, which is different than the lawmakers. Ernesto, if you have a question, we would love to hear from you.
First question today is from Vanessa Mosley, who's an alumni guest. She was a graduate of the CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies and the CUNY School of Professional Studies, and is currently working at the New York City Department of Homeless Services. The current focus for New York City is on the economic recovery and its fiscal sustainability. Some issues have already been discussed here, but what will the strategy be for the new administration as they walk through the door with other issues, such as the end of the rent moratorium, the continuation of high unemployment, and suspected COVID case increases?
Gloria, that's a nice, simple, small question.
I think that, you know, this is one of the many challenges that Eric Adams is going to have to deal with. And I think that we are seeing him already show us how he's going to do it. And I think, you know, over the last couple of weeks, he spent a lot of time talking about the importance of big business and talking about the importance of sort of bringing back a lot of the people that Mayor de Blasio sort of alienated because he wasn't really interested in bringing those people to the table. I think what we've seen is that, again, going back to the point in which we started, the importance of collaboration, Eric Adams is talking about the need to bring them all in and work together. There will be a lot of questions. How much is Eric Adams going to be willing to do for the business community? How much is he going to give in? What is he going to be willing to give up? Especially on the point of homelessness that the person raises. You know, this is a really complicated question with a simple answer. And the answer is, in order to tackle homelessness effectively, you have to build housing. It's not a question of adding more shelters. It's not a question of, you know, adding services. All of that is good and necessary. But really, the way to end homelessness is to build more housing. And the city has a major problem when it comes to building anything, especially affordable housing. And so he's really going to have to come in there with some different ideas, or at least an approach to a willingness to do things differently. And if that means that he's willing to negotiate with whether it's the business community or the real estate community to get some of those goals accomplished, I think that will be significant. We'll see. It's a very hard ask, but all of that is going to come together because solving the homelessness crisis, solving the increase in crime, solving unemployment are all key to the recovery. And Adams talks about this constantly. You really can't have one without the other. So you can't focus on recovery if you don't focus on these other things that threaten the possibility of recovery.
I can't believe he's not, Gloria, like Eric Adams, like he's not taking any flack for the fact that he is linking himself to Mike Bloomberg. I find that amazing.
Yeah, it almost gives you an idea of, you know, there's a lot of people in this town, voters, people in government, who miss Michael Bloomberg and who recognize his money and who recognize that he did things. That he did some things well, and I don't know if that's because they believe that he did it well, or if they just believe that the current mayor did some things so poorly, and that the contrast is so stark. So you're right, Liz, that he has been praising Bloomberg. He's been endorsed by Bloomberg. He has been talking about, being inspired by Bloomberg and taking, some ideas from that administration. And you're right, he hasn't really been criticized for it.
I don't understand that at
Well,
all.
Oh, well, I mean, there was a lot of polling around the mayoral campaign where voters still felt very positively and very warmly about Mike Bloomberg. And I think Gloria's right. Some of that may be just the contrast, because there's certainly a lot of things that voters didn't like towards the end, the stop and frisk, clearly, as well as some other policy positions and, sort of the rapid closing of schools and such. But there is something about, sometimes voters need to miss you to, and I think
But he
that's
set the
some of
next
it.
mayor up to fail. I mean, the reality was that a man who had so much money, not on purpose,
I
but
know
he
what you mean.
used his money to support so many causes like the arts and the libraries and the Doe Fund and all of these things that usually City Hall would use its own money to do. And he freed up money to then do things like, cut contracts with the cops, although they didn't like him in the beginning either. But the point of the matter is that like nobody except a self-funding multi-billionaire like Mike Bloomberg could continue in that model. And so whoever was coming next was going to have to deal with the fact that they could not continue that largesse. And as a result,
But part of the problem too is that he clearly decided to run against the guy, right?
right.
And so
Well,
that
right. There's that.
that's right. So you can't even be the sort of, you can't even take the torch if you throw it once it gets into your
right.
hands.
And if you parse the polling data, if you get into the crosstabs, what you see is if you pull stop and frisk out of the equation, which is very difficult to do, but if you did that, people's perception of Bloomberg and the Bloomberg years was far more positive. And the other mistake de Blasio made, and I don't mean to dump on the guy, is he didn't really work hard at the job. I mean,
No.
he tried to be mayor as senator, and it doesn't work that way. Being mayor, as Gloria pointed out, is doing the hard nitty-gritty work of building housing. Say what you will about Ed Koch and Fiorello LaGuardia, they built a lot of housing. That's what a mayor can do. Talking about ending inequality that is literally a global problem is not something any mayor can do. You can build housing, you can improve schools, you can fight crime, you can improve the environment by building resiliency, but having a Hegelian dialectic about progressive causes is not what people want in a mayor.
I
That's
don't
what
even
they're
know what that
looking to in a United States senator. What?
Well, and we're gonna see. It's gonna be interesting to see if Eric Adams learned that lesson from the de Blasio years, because Eric Adams is already talking about being the new face of the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
and he doesn't mean the local Democratic Party.
Right.
He means the national party. So I would not underestimate Eric Adams and any effort he might make to rise to the national stage. Now, any mayor should be able to do that. This is the largest city in America, and you have arguably one of the most important jobs after the president of the United States. The question is how you use that bully pulpit. Mike Bloomberg did it. His money helped. He put all his money into these big issues at the time, gun control, and so on. The mayor did it in a different way, mainly because he was always looking to run for the next big thing. But I think Eric Adams will also have a good opportunity to do that. We like to say that elections are, in terms of mayoral elections, they're a reaction to the previous mayor. So with de Blasio, we saw him run as the anti-Bloomberg. With Eric Adams, now we see him almost, I wouldn't say that he ran as a Bloomberg, but he is trying to remind people of what life could be like before we had de Blasio. He actually, I find him that he's actually quite critical of de Blasio and has this sort of adept way of criticizing him without looking like he's totally slamming him. And it's fun to watch because de Blasio, really doesn't ever try to even defend
Yet he
himself.
had the political dexterity to use de Blasio to help him get three key union
Yeah.
support
Right.
while he was implicitly running against him. That is real political skill.
Yes.
But he
Right.
also, just to be clear, I mean, he sees the astute thing about Eric Adams, and he was a senator, and I covered him then when I was a reporter in previous lives. But he sees his opportunities and he takes them, which is really the hallmark of any good politician or
Yeah.
elected
Yeah.
official, which is
Yeah.
synonymous, really. So when Ocasio-Cortez goes to the Met Gala, which is a massive and expensive thing, even though she didn't pay for it, and then wears a dress that says tax the rich, the dichotomy of that is so obvious that it tees up this, obvious home run for him, and he swings at it. So I think that to the degree to which, one of the things that's like sort of politics 101 is don't provide your opponents with the opportunity to hit you in the face. So I think that there's a lot, one of the things when you talk about the old versus young, Basil, which I think is a really interesting sort of side note to a lot of what's going on, there's also sort of experience versus inexperience, right? And so there's passion versus knowledge, and there's like, there does have to be some recognition, and I'm not just saying this because I happen to be pushing 50, but like that there's a value in having experience, and that does not necessarily mean that just because you're a veteran lawmaker that you should automatically get pushed out by a progressive challenger.
Right.
Yes, let me go to Ernesto and get one more question in. We're running short on time, but Ernesto?
Our second question today comes from Megan Millen, who is a graduate student at CUNY School of Public Health and Health Policy. And she asks, as an activist, do you feel or think it's better to focus on local or national politics?
Local.
Always local.
Always local.
All politics is local, is what we like to say.
Hello, Moynihan.
In
No,
New
Tip
York.
O'Neill. Wait,
Tip
Tip
O'Neill.
O'Neill. Sorry.
Actually, it was James Farley who said it, and Tip O'Neill stole it. So it was a
Okay,
New Yorker who said it, not Tip
All
O'Neill.
politics is local, and I think that I'm going to go ahead on a limb here and say that everyone on the panel would agree with me that the change that you could have, the change that you could make happen at the local level will always impact more people than at the national level, and that I think we're finally coming around to this concept that local elections, local races are so much more important and play such a major role in our daily lives than the presidential election that we vote in every 4 years.
And the
you will be
wins
much
are
more
easier.
effective impacting national politics if you've
True.
served your time on local politics, because you'll have that much more practical knowledge to bring to the fore. So I agree.
But also the wins are easier, and I don't mean that they're easy, because they're not, right? But you can see, like, for example, there are people who've been toiling in the fields on immigration reform, which is a federal issue, right? You really can't impact immigration at the local level. You can nibble around the edges by creating undocumented worker support funds, et cetera. But the reality is that you get a pathway to citizenship from Congress. That's where it happens, not the White House, Congress. So to move those folks, there are people who've been spending 20 years trying to get that to happen. You can move your block. You could dig a tunnel underneath your city block faster than that. So the point is, like, if you really want to affect change in a more immediate way, in a way that you can really see and feel and touch, that's local. And people poo-poo, school board, town board. No, it's local. It's all local.
And to echo all of that, most of the language about what you're entitled to as a resident citizen of whatever state you're in is written at the state level in their constitution.
Correct.
Also,
So any challenges to that, that's where you go.
but you also have, for instance, this is a city of immigrants. Immigration policy is set at a federal level. That policy we try to ameliorate on a local level, and the inhumanity of a national immigration policy. The student asked about healthcare. Healthcare is not a right. It's still, despite Obamacare, despite the Affordable Care Act, those policy decisions are made at a national level. I mean, we just went through a Trump administration that was a horror that, continues to attack the very baseline democracy that we live in. And those local elections, which I'm a great believer in local politics, it really is, that question is asked at a time that politics throughout the country has become nationalized. If you look at, gubernatorial races around the country, it's about Trump and anti-Trump. It's not about local issues, because it's those decisions that bring the bucks and allow us to do the kinds of things Gloria is talking about, that the student is talking about. So it's a complicated question. We have a federal system, so we screw up on all levels. We have about a minute left. I am really reluctant to ask this question, but we keep talking about Mayor de Blasio, or should we be talking about Governor de Blasio?
Yes,
No.
yes, we should.
No,
Yes.
we should not. No.
we should
Well,
not.
I will have a full head of hair before he can
Yeah.
carry the state.
No,
of the
Do not-
union.
but
do not
Gloria
give it
mentioned
life.
this. The Republicans upstate and even some of the more pragmatic Democrats have been using Bill de Blasio as a boogeyman for
True.
years. Upstate
Yes.
New Yorkers know Bill de Blasio and they do not like him.
Okay.
And he
Sure.
does
Well,
not, he is not like
I
the five
only-
boroughs either.
I only said yes for entertainment purposes.
Uh-huh.
Oh, all
because
right. Well, then sure.
all signs point to Mayor de Blasio giving some serious thought to this possibility. I mean, he has said as much yesterday when he was asked whether or not he's getting any closer to deciding, and he has now made it clear he intends to stay in public life. He wants to, or public service, I should say, wants to be in public service. And he, I'm paraphrasing, but he said there's a lot of things in the city and the state that needs to be fixed, as if he had not been sitting in office for the last almost 8 years. I think that this is a mayor who has demonstrated that even if the odds are an enormous mountain in front of him, namely the race for president that he embarked on a few years ago, he is willing to do it. So,
Gloria, I'm sorry. I always make deadline. My time is up. I want to thank you all. I want to thank the students. This was very spirited, and we will see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you all.